What will happen if the U.S. doesn't do anything and just carries on? Mr. Bernanke seems to think that things are working out okay.
If the U.S. does nothing at all and continues to borrow until its lenders won't lend them anymore, that is, then it will just print money. If you recall, that is Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke's ultimate solution, which is why he's called Helicopter Ben. Eventually, you get a collapse of the currency and an effective elimination of all indebtedness. But in this lies horror and madness, for Americans most of all. The second kind of solution would involve taking those rocks off Mr. Bryant's back, that is, paying down the excess debt.
You've got me stumped. I mean, how could the U.S. even begin to pay down enough of its debt to even get back into a solvent condition within your frame of measurement?
How the U.S. could eliminate that much debt is the core of the challenge facing the U.S. today. So let's break the problem down. The U.S. has $31 trillion of excess debt. Excess bank leverage accounts for about $10 to $12 trillion, which is their problem, leaving 18 to 19 trillion. The U.S. consumer has about $5 to $6 trillion excess in his balance sheet. So that leaves the government to deal with about 10 to 12 trillion directly, a manageable amount, as we will see. Now, if the U.S. were an insolvent corporation, you might say that it could do one of two things. First, it could declare bankruptcy and let its creditors worry about the mess. Countries can't do that sort of thing. The other thing that companies do is to sell assets and pay down debt.
That may be easy for a company, but where on earth would the U.S. government find $10 to $12 trillion of assets to sell?
Does the U.S. have $10 to $12 trillion in assets to sell and thereby eliminate its debt? Well, in olden times, this happened with considerable frequency. So how did kings and emperors find the money to pay their debts? The answer was easy. They often sold the right to tax for a period of time, usually a province of that particular kingdom. The noble that bought that right would then tax like crazy to get as much back as possible before the right expired. Now, why can't the U.S. do the same thing? By this, I do not mean that the U.S. would sell China the right to tax California, but the U.S. could sell the same thing in modern dress. It could sell, that is to say, securitize a percentage of its GDP going forward, the present value of which would equate to 10 to 12 trillion. Put a reasonable inflation-free yield on it, make it tax-exempt to keep service costs down, assume a reasonable rate of GDP growth of 2% a year. That's all that's required. That would require a modest 2.8% of U.S. GDP for the next 30 years. Investors would simply swap their current government debt instruments, bonds, all the way down to treasury bills, for the new U.S. government equity units, which I have called American Phoenix Trust units. The beauty of the instrument is that as solvency returns to the U.S. and its GDP growth accelerates over my assumed growth rate, as the Atrel curve indicates it will, holders of the units will earn a nice fat capital gain. And foreign investors who hold a ton of U.S. debt will enjoy an even larger win because the U.S. dollar will strengthen on top of it all.
Isn't this the same debt but just called something else?
Is this the same debt in a different dress? Heck no. This is an equity in all its finery. The risk and rewards of growth are transferred to the buyer, just like any corporate equity outstanding today. The U.S. government simply pays a fixed 2.8% of GDP to the trust, whatever it happens to be. The winners will be the U.S., which will enjoy a return to growth as the dead weight of debt lifts off its shoulders. Unemployment will, of course, decline with growth. Instead of lending to the U.S. just to keep that country barely inching along, the rest of the world can use that money in countries that can use leverage to positive effect.
Ross, it sounds neat, but you don't expect me to believe that the U.S. would actually do anything like this. That's too radical for words.
How radical is my solution? Let me put it another way. When all else fails, try the obvious. For years, the U.S. has been heading into increasingly deeper waters because of more and more debt. Now, I merely propose a way to shuck a pile of it off. What's radical about getting out of insolvency? People and companies do it every day. Why not countries?
Well, for one thing, this has never been done before.
This kind of solution has not been tried before, at least in recent times. But think about it. It's only a matter of scale. Securitization is old hat in the banking industry. Why not use what we know how to do to find a way out? Personally, I don't think that the U.S. wants to become a banana republic with a collapsing currency. Do you?
Well, I have no rebuttal for this. Maybe our audience has. Any last thoughts that you want to add before we go?
I've given you two messages today. First and foremost, think about the Attrill curve and the promise of recovery and growth to come, including global growth, if we get out of this mess. The second issue is the Phoenix Trust idea. If you don't like it, then devise your own answer to the debt problem and get it into the public realm as fast as possible. The dead weight of too much debt is slowly crushing the life out of the American economy. And arguing about the merits of the Phoenix Trust idea, while forgetting what we're trying to do, is self-defeating. Japan continues to find out the hard way. Will the U.S. do the same thing? Or will it get the job done quickly and efficiently? Finally, you can obtain the full text of Phoenix Rising, Is There Life After Debt? By going to our website, www.strategicanalysis.ca, and clicking on Library. Frankly, I would appreciate it if you would let me know what you think and what your own ideas might be so that everyone can read it.
Ross, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed our talk.
Thank you, Mike.